Welcome back to HSH 1000 Human Condition. I'm Dr. Cathay Lu, and over the next 4 videos, I'll accompany you as you journey from the world of Gilgamesh in ancient Mesopotamia to explore the world of Xunzi in ancient China, as the Warring States period ends and China's first imperial dynasty begins. Not only are you traversing across a continent, but you're also leaping approximately 2.5 millennia through time. This sudden change can feel a little jarring, but in this video and the next, videos 9 and 10, I will help you acclimate. So I'm going to give you some tips and secrets to making this transition to Xunzi easier. And later in video 10, I'll orient you further by adding a little bit of color to our cast of characters. But once you've had a chance to acclimate, next week in videos 11 and 12, we'll dig in and explore Xunzi in earnest, where I'm really excited to show you some of the most beautiful and magical parts of this text in this world. So for now, rest those weary feet after a long journey while I outline the plan for the rest of this video. So first, I'm going to give you a basic account of pre-feudal and feudal China's conditions that eventually lead to centuries of devastating war and destruction. And then I'll explain how keeping this background and context in mind helps unlock the secret to approaching the Xunzi text, both in terms of its content and its form. By the end of this video, you should be able to identify the pressing concerns of the Warring States period, classify the genre of this text, while identifying examples of at least 2 of the persuasive methods Xunzi uses, metaphor and argument. So are you ready? Let's go check out the world of Xunzi. As I mentioned before, Xunzi lived at the very end of the Warring States period of what we consider China. Just as Dr. Suresh discussed in video 8 about how the Silk Road is not a single monolithic entity, so too for China. This is a term that came later, and one with a limiting paradigm. So keep in mind that there isn't a single common criterion that tidally applies to all territories, ethnicities, languages, and regions that fall under the scope through time. We'll revisit this when we talk about names and the conventions of language towards the end of video 10. But keeping this caveat in mind, we'll roll with the term China through the rest of the videos. The Warring States period lasted about 2.5 centuries, and it was a time of massive suffering that started in the later part of the Zhou dynasty. But let me start further back and explain how China actually got to that point. So, much like in Mesopotamia, accounts of the past had been passed down orally and only later recorded in writing. And these included legends of heroes who established the developments necessary for human civilization. And there's lots of similarities in the set of feats such divine kings accomplished in Mesopotamia and in China. So in China, the sovereigns domesticated animals, established agricultural practices, trade, commerce, invented writing, and silk. Or take the 3 sage kings. They created the calendar, established music and rituals, governmental structures, and flood control. Another amazing aspect of the Sage Kings was their system of abdication, where they selected the best person to take over their job, sometimes bypassing their own son for a more capable candidate. According to legend, leaders of different tribes came together to form an alliance rather than wage war. And using a democratic military customs, the head of the coalitions were elected by tribal representatives. So there's this paradigm example of this found in the legend of the sage king, Yao, who passed over his own son in favor of a worthy, impressive, and, depending on which account you believe, a low-born man, Shun. Later, Shun too would skip over his own son in favor of Yu, who had impressed everyone with his work to control the waters. However, after Yu passed, the throne went to or was taken by his son, leading to the legendary first dynasty of the Xia, which marked the start of hereditary rule and succession, a practice continued by the Shang dynasty that followed. Then, around 1122 BCE, there was a man Wu who was from Zhou, and he overthrew the tyrant Shang king and thus started the Zhou dynasty, which spanning nearly 800 years is still China's longest. So the Zhou dynasty is divided into 2 periods, the Western and the Eastern. The names refer to the relative locations of their capitals. The Western Zhou was the Golden Age, and then 400 years later, things started to get a bit dicey. There was a sacking of a capital, the murder of a king, and so the Zhou had to move their capital eastward, hence Eastern Zhou, which was the much, much less golden period. But before we get into the death and destruction of the Eastern Zhou period, let's spend a minute or 2 more in the nice golden period and stall our descent. This change to hereditary practices came the beginnings of what gets anachronistically labeled a feudal system in China, where the former tribes became small vassal states and a new aristocratic class came to the fore. The Zhou would come to build up this feudal system while also amplifying and building upon existing Shang ritual practices. You see, when the Zhou first deposed the Shang, they consolidated the power, and the Zhou domain was much larger than that of the Song, and it was a bit too much for anyone to rule over alone. So they divided the territory into smaller units, which they enfiefed to their family members. That is, they put in rulers for that local area, a regional lord, where the regional lords are family members you generally trust. And trust them you must, because these regional lords ruled their states with a significant amount of autonomy. They were free to maintain their own armies and essentially have their own lineal descendants rule in perpetuity. The only real requirements were that they had to send seasonal tributes to the Zhou king, make an occasional formal visit to the Zhou court, and when needed or called upon to do so, they had to contribute military aid to fight the barbarians or contribute to disaster relief. Now, to consolidate their own regional power, the regional lords would in turn enfief their own close relatives, granting them smaller parcels of hereditary land. And these high ministers and great officers would serve in the court of their lord's state. The children of these men would come to occupy the lowest rank of nobility, the class of the shi, or men of service, who filled the lower ranks of government administration. But basically, the structure of the ruling nobility in the Zhou operated under the structure of an extended family, right? The familial bonds secured by strength of family loyalties were being reinforced through ritual practices. Tributes, formal visits, etc. were all governed by rules of protocol called li, or rituals. They were ceremonial practices and sumptuary regulations that governed occasions such as funerals, sacrifices, marriages, diplomatic events, or investitures where oaths were sworn. The ancestor worship ceremonies of the Song were integrated into the Zhou dynasty. So, for example, ceremonies in which tribes or territories made treaties were sealed with the sacrifice of an animal, whose blood was then smeared on their lips while they swore an oath to uphold the provisions of the treaty, lest the ancestor spirits punish them. We'll discuss rituals a bit more later in video 10, but for now just know that it was a softer form of maintaining power that was used to demonstrate and reinforce hierarchy, rank, and loyalty. Look, maintaining power using rituals to reinforce your agreements and family values was much cheaper than attempting to maintain power and loyalty through brute force through your military, right? So rather than legal or bureaucratic means, it was rituals that had secured familial loyalties across the extended family. And this is what was being used to hold this whole kingdom together. Eventually, the Zhou had about some 200 smaller kingdoms or states all over. They're semi-autonomous, but distantly related by blood. And this was the fatal flaw in the system. The kinship relationships would naturally grow distant over time. So, for example, initially, the lords of two states might have been brothers at the start, but their heirs would have been cousins, and their heirs would have been second cousins, and so on down the line. So over time, as the familial bonds started to weaken, homage to the Zhou house and the king would deteriorate, and then regional lords started to compete with each other for territory and power. Conflict not only broke out into wars between the states, but it also led to an increase in civil wars within the state itself, as the ministerial families also were joining in for the jostling of power and position. Hence, you can see how the Western Zhou ended up with regicide and the sacking of a capital that needed to be reestablished somewhere where they still had steadfast support. So the reasons for the collapse of the Zhou are largely structural and internal, but the level of death and destruction had external factors. In the Golden Era, battle was conducted by aristocrats in chariots. But this was a really expensive form of warfare. It requires a ton of resources to make the chariots and then to develop and train skilled warriors such as charioteers or archers, not to mention the care and maintenance of so many horses. But over the centuries, battle had changed. The invention of the crossbow meant that you could conscript any unskilled peasant to shoot at horses or people from much further away. So this allowed for the large-scale slaughter of conscripted infantries that were put into the field to fight each other. Misery and death, famine, devastation, it's easy to see how this increased with the rise in rebellions and violent attempts to annex or overthrow your neighbors. But let me not end on this downer. As the decline of the Eastern Zhou continues, this is what gets called the Spring and Autumn period. It also created a period of modernization. So actually, this need for change created opportunities. Already, you had the shi, but let's think about it. As smaller states are getting annexed by larger states, this means a lot of aristocratic families lose their land and their titles. So suddenly they find that they need to go get a job. What do? They go around offering their services, or they teach. But here's a particular anachronistic comparison that I'm rather fond of. You can think about these people as a bunch of management consultants that are trying to offer their services to help rulers with their mergers and acquisitions, right? Or their internal management structure or research and development pipeline. But this is why during this period, you have the 100 schools of thought. It's a forum or marketplace of educated people trying to sell you their consulting services, each with their own ideas about what to do and how to live, training and teaching junior associates to do the same, and travel around with their pitch decks hoping to land the job. And they were needed, too. All the states, whether they were large or small, were really nervous and alert about what might happen next. No one felt safe. Everyone is interested in strengthening their state and staying alive. And there's an increasing will to employ talented people outside their own bloodlines because, as it turns out, you really can't trust those distant relatives at all. So, 100 schools of thought addressed a multitude of needs. For example, they needed people with a talent for diplomacy or knowledge of ritual practices. And as military warfare changed, they needed someone to advise on military reform, on how to increase the population to field large armies, or how to effectively tax people to finance these projects. But you can't tax or extract what doesn't exist, so you also need to figure out how to encourage production, which requires land. And if you can't attain land by conquest, you're going to have to learn how to develop the wastelands. So before, you had relied on feudal structures, but clearly that's not working anymore. So here comes the development of bureaucracy, better record keeping, and census records. This period ends up encouraging the growth of industry, craftsmanship, and inventions. Economic systems also increased in scale. Currency replaced barter as the main form of economic practice, and wealth accumulation also becomes possible because it's no longer tied to the land title or state power. You end up getting a large merchant class. Later in video 10, we'll discuss broader and more significant developments of social structure and mobility. But this all takes us back to where we landed: the warfare, starvation, the world of bloodshed and chaos. There's been a collapse of the social order and the old values and beliefs. By the time we get to the spring and autumn period, the 200 states from before have already reduced to about 100. And then, over the course of the next 240 years, it's going to go from 100 to about 40. There'll be 500 battles between states, 100 civil wars, and the fall of many aristocratic families and the rise of a fewer number of powerful states. There had been a center of political power. Now it's going to move out towards the feudal states and their minister territories. This is the world that you've now landed in with Shunzi. Okay, so let me explain how this is going to help you approach the Shunzi text. I have 3 points. The first one, I want you to keep this historical context in mind, because it's going to help you understand the pressing set of problems and concerns those living in this period would have had to deal with. At first, this seems obvious, but let me make it a little bit more nuanced, because where along the timeline of events a thinker is living will make a difference too. For example, if you're living here where things are getting bad, but you're not totally in the full-blown warring states, as this guy Kongzu was, you'd have a very different set of views and concerns compared to someone who's living over there towards the end of the warring states when things are starting to get a little bit more consolidated. Some of the earlier people are going to be interested in trying to stop the feudal system from collapsing into the looming chaos. But if you're already somewhere in the thick of things, and there's really no point in avoiding it, your concerns are going to be how to triage the current problem so that you can have the luxury of figuring out what to do next. And if, like Shunzi, you're coming in towards the end and starting to see power get more consolidated, you might be more interested in giving an account of what would be the best way to rebuild going forward. That's based on an account of what lessons you've learned from the last century of chaos. This becomes even more nuanced when you factor in my second point. Remember that a whole set of scholars and thinkers for hire, those that I've jokingly compared to management consultants, are actually running around trying to offer answers and solutions to these problems. And as much competition as there is out amongst the states in the battlefield, so too in the marketplace of ideas, right? As these thinkers are pitching themselves, they're also going to attack their opposition as flawed alternatives. So put these two factors together. Keep in mind where along the timeline Shunzi is coming in. He comes towards the end of the period, and this means two things. There's going to be slightly different views and concerns that are based on the current conditions of his time. But he also enters in the middle of existing and ongoing disputes and arguments, right, that he's going to be expected to weigh in on. Coming after an exciting narrative poem, I can see how initially this Xunzi text seems less accessible. And though the text is masterfully written, unfortunately, some of its pleasing literary features, such as its meter and lyric style, gets lost in the translation. But there's still much we can admire and appreciate in the translations that we have. And learning how to appreciate this text has the added benefit of helping you approach and understand it more easily. Which leads me to my last point. Just as you were mindful of the genre of the text you were reading in the previous weeks, you should do the same for this text as well, to keep in mind the genre and the form of Xunzi. From this period, sometimes the texts that we get are partial records or recorded after the fact of the events it's purporting to discuss. Or maybe they're collected stories. For example, take the Analects, a major source for the teachings of Kongzi. The title of the text itself, the 论语, it means collected sayings or ordered statements. It's said to be compiled by his disciples from their own records sometime after Kongzi passed away. So you could think of it as a collection of different disciples' minutes or notes. You can keep this example in mind when you get to No Exit and Dr. Uyan talks about primary and secondary sources. Many other texts, including our text, fall in the genre of a persuasive essay. So Xunzi and others were trying to persuade a ruler or minister to view or believe their account as the correct and most compelling. They're trying to persuade their audience to accept their claim, and in order to do so, they'll then need to make an argument to support and motivate that claim using reasons and evidence. The more support a claim has, the more compelling the claim is. While there's no prescribed form for a persuasive essay, there are some general patterns to look for, and knowing this will make reading the text much easier. You'll see Xunzi argue for his claims and add support using 3 types of moves, and these ways can be mixed and used together in combination. The first way is to give a series of reasons that argue directly for the truth of his claim. The second way he adds support for his claims is to elaborate on his points using figurative language and comparisons through his metaphors. And then the third way is to provide a series of reasons that explain why other alternative views, like those of his opponents, are not true and should not be considered contenders. All right, let me explain and show you what I mean using chapter 23 as an example. This is a view that Xunzi is famous for and one that many people misunderstand. I'm going to have a lot more to say about this later in video 11, but for now, as the chapter heading suggests, Xunzi claims that human nature is bad. In fact, he says so several times. I know, at first y'all think he's really repetitive, but actually you're going to come to appreciate this because it's going to help you see the structure and shape of his arguments. So pull up the PDF of the text and have a look with me at the first 4 paragraphs. As you can see, what Xunzi does is what all of your persuasive essays and academic papers should do in the introduction at the very beginning. You should state the thesis or the main claim. In our case, the first 2 sentences of the first paragraph. He writes, "People's nature is bad. Their goodness is a matter of deliberate effort." And notice at the end of this paragraph, he repeats himself. Looking at it this way, it's clear that people's nature is bad and their goodness is a matter of deliberate effort. If you look at the last sentence of the second paragraph, you'll notice that he repeats himself again, word for word. All right, at this point, you should pause and take a moment to skim these 2 paragraphs. Don't worry if you don't feel like you understand what's going on right now. The purpose is just to get a feel for the text. So if you haven't already done so, you should check out our video guide on doing a vibe check, but take like 5 minutes to skim the paragraph and then come back and join me. I'll wait. Okay. After you've skimmed it over, one thing you'll notice is the general structure of what's happening in these paragraphs. Xunzi states at the start the main claim he wants to persuade you to believe, right, that people are bad. Then there's a middle part that's a series of stacked reasons which lead to an intermediate claim that he uses to support his main claim, which he helpfully reasserts. So even if you aren't following all the details in the middle yet, you already have a sense or a feel for what's going on. People's nature is such that they're kind of like this. If you follow along with this, then something bad will happen. And he does this 3 times. Then these 3 points together support the intermediate claim, which leads him to conclude his main one, that human natures are bad and their goodness takes effort. As you're reading the text for the first time, all you need to notice is the claim he's arguing for and where or when he's giving reasons in support. Don't worry initially about grasping all the details. It's not necessary. It's more than enough to just start by identifying a cluster of support for a claim. This allows you to be more intentional in what you decide to go back to later for a targeted close reading. Having considered the first paragraph, you can now more easily see how the second paragraph is similar, right? It's a line of support for the same main claim, that last sentence. There's a few different types of moves that Xunzi uses here, but right now I just want you to notice how this paragraph starts. This is an example of the second type of move I had mentioned before, his use of metaphors to illustrate his point. While not strictly in the form of a metaphor, you can see how Xunzi is still comparing human nature with these raw materials that only become transformed into something desirable after some work is applied to them. The rest of the paragraph then fills out the metaphor by drawing parallels so that the consequence of this comparison means that, surprise, human nature is bad and their goodness is a matter of deliberate effort. You might not think of a metaphor as an argument, but it's still being used as support for his claim. Xunzi uses metaphors to illustrate how sensible his views are by showing how similar it is to something else that doesn't seem contentious or at least as obvious. If you agree that the reasoning holds in the obvious or literal case, then he's explaining how all the truths between the things in the source domain would map or correspond to his target domain. Again, when you do your first quick read through the Xunzi, it's less important to understand the details of his reasons and support, but more important that you can identify this as the type of move he's making in support of his claim. That's all you're aiming for initially. All right, finally, let's skim the third and fourth paragraphs. These paragraphs seem a bit different, right? Like Xunzi doesn't start nor end these paragraphs with his main claim. Now, don't you kind of miss it? Though it seems like they're maybe still related, the third paragraph at least says something or another about nature and deliberate effort, but the fourth is about nature's and eyes and ears. So what's going on? This is an example of the third type of move I mentioned before. There's some opposing view out there, in this case one of Mengzi's, that goes against Xunzi's views. So to persuade you to accept Xunzi's claims, he's going to explain why Mengzi is problematic. Another way to think about what's going on is to see it as a clapback or a relatively polite diss. It's still grounded in reasons and not yet mere name-calling because it's still a professional setting after all. But if you've ever witnessed or participated in an argument with someone, then you know that even when the disagreement is over one general issue, the participants can sometimes get lost in a litany of arguments over smaller and smaller related grievances. So that even though the argument started over what constitutes a just response for slaying the bull of heaven, you suddenly find yourself sidetracked and arguing about how many examples from the past should be used when you decline a romantic overture from Ishtar. But that's basically what's happening here through the rest of chapter 23. Xunzi has several different angles of disagreement he wants to cover, but it all adds up to the same thing. Mengzi is wrong. He's wrong in all of these different ways that disagree with Xunzi's more superior point. But because there's so many smaller points of contention, and Xunzi just can't stop himself from going through them and thoroughly enumerating all the ways. The total shape and structure of his reasons are more complex and harder to see. So it's totally normal to get a little lost and confused in these cases. But I'm going to give you the same advice. Do not worry about understanding the details right now. Just congratulate yourself for identifying this as Xunzi's strategy in this chunk of the text and keep moving forward. In later weeks or in seminar, you can always go back to specific parts to look more closely. But by then, it'll be so much easier because you'll have built a general sense of what the most important main claims are and the types of reasons he's been using to support them. Just having this familiarity will make your closer reading more tractable later on. It's really like magic. Hey, bonus points and gold stars to you if you've also noticed that while he's explaining why Mengzi is wrong, he's supporting his claim with the use of metaphor as well. All right, let me review what we covered in this first video on Xunzi. We started by getting a sense of the events and features of the time period in which Xunzi lived by considering the history of the events that led up to the Warring States period. Then we reviewed 3 ways that keeping this history in mind contributes to understanding what kind of a text you're reading. right? That coming towards the end of the Warring States period, after a whole series of different thinkers have already been developing and circulating their views, it means that Xunzi inherits some of those earlier debates while he's also considering the shifting landscape of his own time. That means this text is a persuasive essay for his own original views while intermingled with his response or the clapbacks at his opponents. And finally, we identified 3 ways that Xunzi uses to support and persuade readers of his views in the text. Look out for these moves in your reading. Knowing when or that he's using these ways to support his claims is the secret to making this text more accessible. So focus on just identifying instances of them without trying to grasp the details when you do your reading. As you've already seen while just skimming chapter 23, it's as if we landed in the middle of an ongoing battle of thoughts, if not the literal battlefield. And since it's mid-battle, it can feel like you're missing something, especially since you're only hearing Xunzi's side of the conversation. So next, in video 10, I'm going to fill you in on a few specific opponents and views that Xunzi is dealing with and kind of give you the juicy backstory. That way, when you see Xunzi cook an opponent, you're going to be in on it. All right? So see you in video 10.